Hello from our own correspondent studios at Broadcasting House in London. You've downloaded the latest edition of the programme broadcast on BBC Radio 4. It's introduced by Kate Adie.
Today, men who didn't think war was worth it rise to the top of American politics. Why people in Aleppo are turning their backs on the Free Syrian Army and looking to the Islamists for help. Murder on the streets of Corsica as the settling of old scores continues against a Mediterranean backdrop. And Hannibal conquered the mountains in just 16 days. The Italians, we learn, are taking considerably longer. So, President Obama has set out his priorities for the next 4 years in his first State of the Union address since re-election. It was a wide-ranging speech focusing partly on building a stronger America. He told Congress that 34,000 troops were coming home from Afghanistan and that by the end of 2014, America's war there would be over. Now, the President's made a number of key appointments as he heads into his new term. Mark Mardell's been considering just how much military experience has shaped them.
The President appears to have been to the barber's before his State of the Union speech. A severe buzz cut underlined his militant mood, but it was his hands that mesmerised me, palms wide apart, repeatedly chopping the air in tandem, as if measuring the enormous scope of his ambition. He name-checked nearly everything on his party's wish list, but one item was what they don't want. We don't need to occupy other nations or send thousands of our sons and daughters overseas, he declared. Pretty important when military action against Iran or North Korea is repeatedly said to be an option. His choice of a new Defence Secretary and new Secretary of State could be intended to lock him into that promise. John Kerry's hooked profile and shock of steely grey hair cry out to be crowned by laurels. He's been a senator for a mere 29 years, but one can easily imagine him 2,000 years ago, a patrician presence guiding imperial Rome through war and peace. But it's not appearance alone that demands that laurel wreath. Until now he's been the nearly man. He ran for president in 2004, and he seems marked by yearning to leave his stamp on history. He's smooth and nuanced, but not bloodless. It's worth remembering how he looked and sounded when he first appeared on the Washington stage. The jaw still juts out of a lean face, the abundant hair is even cut the same, but it was dark then, and he was dressed in drab military fatigues, adorned only with one colourful line of ribbons, 3 purple hearts, a silver star and a bronze star. A 27-year-old Vietnam veteran in a fury about the war that he believed had made his country lie, made his friends war criminals, and made paranoid hypocrisy a way of life. An angry young man asking senators a question which could, perhaps should, echo down the ages. How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? Then remember one of the reasons why President Obama said he chose Chuck Hagel to be America's next Secretary of State for Defense, that he'd have the respect of the troops he would lead, the first enlisted soldier to head that department. He left Southeast Asia with 2 Purple Hearts, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, the Combat Infantryman's Badge, and shrapnel lodged in his chest from a booby-trap bomb. He doesn't often wear the medals these days, but the shrapnel is still there. Hagel, a former Republican senator, is loathed by some of his former party colleagues because of his opposition to the way the Iraq war was fought. He faced an intensely hostile Senate confirmation hearing. His one-time allies pompously demanded one-word answers to complex questions, gotcha questions as they're called here, designed only to catch him out. It was one of the most dispiriting displays I've witnessed in Congress. A petty, vicious display by men entirely uninterested in attempting to divine answers about what might drive the United States foreign policy over the next 4 years. Had they not been consumed by a craving to put the boot into a turncoat, they could have discovered something about Hagel's approach to war, and so to Obama's complex, foggy foreign policy. Throughout his political career, Hagel has adopted a stance that might make him a very unusual defence secretary. It's said to be one of the burdens of high office that politicians sometimes have to, or feel they have to, treat people as pieces on a chessboard. But Hagel stresses he takes a pawn's eye view. He says he speaks for the ghosts of the past, the soldiers who've sat in jungles or foxholes and watched their friends get their heads blown off. These 2 men are the diametric opposites to those chicken hawks who still flap around Washington, those ever eager for their nation to go to war, who ducked and dodged every opportunity to test their own mettle under fire, not even armchair generals, but politicians cowering behind the sofa, yelling war cries. So Obama says a lot about himself by selecting men who are decorated heroes of a war that scarred and divided America. It might sound odd with all the books and films that have picked over Vietnam and parsed its every paragraph, but America is reluctant to draw conclusions about that war. These two men show no such doubts. They just don't think it was worth it. They both supported the Iraq War at first, but now don't think it was worth it. They wouldn't say that about Afghanistan, not about a war still being fought, a war where no politician can afford to ask Kerry's question. But I would love to know what Hagel and Kerry and Obama would answer in their hearts to the question, was it worth it?
And that's Mark Mardell in Washington, and who, if anyone, will be saying the war was worth it when the dust finally settles in Syria. In some parts of the country, particularly the north, the rebel Free Syrian Army now faces increasing criticism. Its fighters are accused of looting and incompetence, as well as ruinous infighting. Ruth Sherlock, who's been in the city of Aleppo, says that amid the chaos, the jihadists of the al-Nusra Front are becoming more and more powerful.
Abu Hussam was a commander in the Free Syrian Army. I met him in a safe house in Aleppo. He had just got out of jail. Slowly, painfully, he rolled up his trousers to show me the deep black bruising across both of his lower legs. Torture, he said. My cell was a toilet cubicle. When they tortured me, he added, 2 men held me down, 6 others beat me with cables. It lasted for 3 hours. His jailers, he told me, were Islamists from a new Sharia court set up in rebel-held Aleppo. He had been detained for 36 days before they finally deemed him not guilty. The charges against Mr. Hussam had included spending time with women, smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, and even more improbably, in the middle of a war, starting a nightclub in his home. He suspected his arrest had also been revenge for his support of another, more moderate court. But the fact that his fighters had not been able to force his release is a sign of the Sharia court's power. 6 months ago, when the rebels stormed the city, such a hardline Wahhabi Islamist system would not have existed in Aleppo. The aspiration to create an uncompromising society governed by Sharia law is at odds with the gentle Sufi culture of most of its Muslim residents. But the war has turned this mercantile city, once a trading hub for gold, jewellery and expensive silks, into a place of depravity and despair. Mounds of rubbish lie rotting on its streets, families live in bombed-out ruins, and the wounded are left to beg for their next meal. Furious at what the main rebel group, the FSA, has done to their city and to their livelihoods, Aleppo's destitute people are now turning to the Islamists for help. Chief among them is Jabhat al-Nusra, a jihadist group that the United States has blacklisted as a terrorist organisation. In recent months, this group, which shares sympathies with al-Qaeda, has claimed responsibility for a litany of car and suicide bombings against government targets, but which have also killed hundreds of civilians. Already known for being some of the bravest fighters, in the last few weeks the group has turned its hand to helping civilians. I met Haji Rasul, an emir or leader in the Nusra Front. The common etiquette when conducting an interview is to sit facing your interviewee, listen carefully, and sometimes give an encouraging smile. This was not the right approach with Haji Rasul. Wearing a beige robe, his face framed by a prayer cap and long beard, he faced forwards in the front seat of the people carrier. His security detail of 7 armed men in black uniforms surrounded the car. I sat 3 rows back, squashed up in a small seat in the boot that put as much distance as possible between us. Respectful of his strict interpretation of Islam, I had dressed in a demure black hijab and loose clothing, but Haji Rasul still moved the rearview mirror so as to avoid accidentally glimpsing my reflection. The biggest help they are giving is with bread. When they seized the grain stores, the FSA were accused of looting. The bread supply to Aleppo, a vital staple for many, all but ceased. Now Jabhat have monopolised the warehouses and are carefully managing them. We have 4 factories working and each has the capacity to make 150 tons of flour per day, said Haji Rasul. We are able to feed all of the liberated territories in Syria. The operation is indeed impressive. In one Aleppo district, I watched as bakers tirelessly churned out Jabbat's piping hot flat bread and sold it at bargain price. In this area alone, they feed more than 26,500 families. The Nusra Front's other projects include subsidising farmers to replant wheat fields, bringing oil and gas to Aleppo, restarting medicine factories and collecting rubbish. I asked the bakery manager why he thought Jabhat had succeeded in these projects when other rebels are still barely able to sustain their own groups. And what did he think their motivation was? Smiling, he pointed to the sky and replied with one word, Allah, God. The aid is organised through the Sharia court that Jabhat al-Nusra shares with 3 other of the most hardline groups. This has given it and its Islamist social template more and more power over Syria's most populous city. They provide us with heating and bread, and they are good Muslims, said one father of 9. 80% of the FSA are rotten. The prowess of Islamists in Aleppo is a source of seething resentment for many FSA groups and secular Syrian citizens alike. During popular protests, calls for support of pro-democracy rebels still outnumber the cries for the Islamic army. But whilst the Islamists are better funded and better organised, there is little that these others can do.
That was Ruth Sherlock, and hundreds of Tunisians have been protesting outside the country's National Assembly, demanding the resignation of the Islamist-led government. Prominent among them was the widow of Chokri Belaid, a leftist opposition figure and critic of the government who was assassinated last week. There's talk of a new cabinet, partly consisting of non-political technocrats, emerging from talks which have been continuing all week. Our correspondent, Wera Davis, says it's clear Tunisia is deeply divided.
He sat there, like a mannequin in the shop window, almost still, but not quite. His eyes flashed from side to side nervously, but the rest of his body hardly moved, and for more than an hour he remained there, guarding his important little part of the Tunisian revolution. He works at Al-Kitab, probably the best-known bookshop in Tunis. Modest in size, but rich in its literary offerings. Novels, history books and textbooks, in Arabic, French and a small section in English. Ever since 1967, Al-Kitab has occupied a prominent space in Bourguiba Avenue, the main thoroughfare that runs through the modern heart of the Tunisian capital. At its far end is the imposing Bab al-Bahar, the huge stone arch that separates modern Tunis from the old historic Medina. Bourguiba Avenue is also where the revolution of 2011 was largely played out, where Tunisians of all ages and faiths protested and battled until they overthrew the authoritarian regime of Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali. It was the first of the Arab uprisings, paving the way for similar movements in Egypt, Libya and beyond. 2 years later, and there's a disturbingly familiar feel to the avenue. The choking taste of tear gas drifts across the tree-lined streets. Plainclothes militias, their faces covered by black masks, hang around menacingly on street corners. At the Al-Kitab bookshop, they're worried the rioters and looters may come back. The shop assistant's boss and owner of the bookshop is Selma Jabes. She tells me there were lots of books they couldn't sell during the dictatorship. Books in particular about contemporary politics and the ruling family were banned, she says. The previous regime didn't promote Tunisian culture at all. Quite the opposite. What preoccupies Mrs. Jabes now, and many like her who supported the overthrow of the regime, is the direction being taken by Tunisia's new leaders. We're nearly all Muslims, but this is not an Islamic country, she says. People want a democratic future. She's typical of the many liberal, more secular Tunisians who say their revolution is being stolen, that the ideals and principles they fought for in January 2011 have somehow been twisted and redefined. For that, Selma Jabes blames Ennahda, the governing Islamist party and its allies. It portrays itself as a moderate branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, trying to weave a difficult path towards democracy between Tunisia's various post-revolutionary factions. On a good day, Bourguiba Avenue can be mistaken for a busy Parisian street. Small groups of men and fashion-conscious women sitting together outside one of the street's many cafes, chatting effusively and openly, mainly in Arabic, but also sometimes in French. But lately, art exhibitions and musical events have been disrupted in the capital. Religious Sufi shrines, regarded as profane by ultra-conservative Muslims, have been desecrated or destroyed. Many women say they're being pressured into covering their hair and to wearing more modest clothing. The selling of alcohol has been restricted in some establishments, and each time I come back to Tunis, it feels a little less like Paris. Shadowy pro-government squads known as the Committees for the Protection of the Revolution operate with semi-official approval. Ostensibly, they seek out remnants of the previous regime, but they're also accused of beating up and harassing Ennahda's political opponents. Last week, events took a dramatic turn for the worse, when the prominent and vocal opposition politician Shukri Belaid was assassinated on his way to work. Less than 24 hours before his death, Belaid had warned in a television interview that political violence was getting out of hand because radicals on the fringes of the ruling party were being allowed to operate with impunity. Ennahda's leaders have emphatically denied being in any way responsible for the murder and have explicitly condemned it. But that didn't quell the anger of more than 1 million people who turned out for Shukri Belaid's funeral last Friday. It's quite clear Tunisia is now deeply divided. The day after Shukri Belaid's funeral, a big crowd of pro-Ennahda supporters gathered in Bourguiba Avenue. Bearded men waving the white flags of Ennahda mixed with the black banners of the party's conservative Salafist allies. Their leaders stood on the steps of the municipal theatre just across the road from Selma Jabez's bookshop. "We are Muslims and we will not be moved," they shouted, also denouncing the former colonial power here, France, whose interior minister referred to the dangers of Islamo-fascism in the days after Shukri Belaid's murder. Behind the protest leaders, on the whitewashed walls of the theatre, were two prominent posters, advertising, of all things, a comedy festival later this month. Few people here are in the mood for jokes or political satire, and when I later asked at the theatre if I could speak to someone about the event, I wasn't surprised to learn that Tunisia's inaugural comedy festival has been indefinitely delayed.
Wira Davis in Tunis. It's 15 years since the official French representative on the island of Corsica was shot dead. The prefect, Claude Erignac, was assassinated in the street as he made his way to the theatre. His murder marked a turning point in the Paris government's attitude towards the French island in the Mediterranean. A crackdown was launched on the nationalist uprising there, and yet the violence didn't stop. Instead, it was assimilated into a culture of murder built on clan rivalries and organised crime. Tom Esselmont has been to Corsica to see why the murder rate is still so high.
Murder in Corsica is brazen and fast. The killers disappear, usually without trace, into the silence. At times it seems you cannot go more than a few metres without passing another spot where someone was assassinated. In Ajaccio, a businessman was shot dead last year near the Place Diamant, in full view of his wife and child. Nearby, a father of two was gunned down as he closed his shop. That killing came soon after a well-known gang member met his end in a village butcher's shop bearing his name. The French call these règlements de compte, the settling of old scores between rival clans or families through vendetta. Most of the murders happen in daylight and almost without fail in a public place. No one minds pointing out the spot, but generally getting an eyewitness to describe what they saw or a relative to discuss their grief is nearly impossible. "You want to get the families of the victims to talk?" said local journalist Pierre. "It's going to be tough, huh?" As I travel from murder scene to murder scene talking to eyewitnesses, asking why is this happening, I get a shrug of the shoulders, a courteous but firm raising of a hand that says no, a sudden outflow of breath, and a glance upwards that says, "I wish I knew," or perhaps what they mean is, "I wish I could tell you." Some say the silence is due to a mafia code of honour, or omertà. Others say it's because people are simply too scared to talk. What is certain is that on an island of just over 300,000 people, many are worried that what they say might catch up with them. That's what I found in the small mountain town of Pontelecce. When I arrived, I could see the marks spray-painted by police on the pavement, highlighting where the bullets or cartridges landed during an attempted murder just a few days earlier. The attackers, who only injured their victim, could not have chosen a more prominent location, right outside a cafe. It now seems to be closed. In the bar next door, we're begged not to film inside. My family is too implicated, says the owner, with a look of regret that suggested she wished she hadn't spoken to us. The woman in the neighbouring boulangerie says she was there that day. She was making pizzas out the back when she heard bangs. When I probe, her friendly smile dies away. She hides behind a metal tray of baguettes, looking busy. Nearby, in the town of Bastia, the priest knows all about the executions and shootings. Le Père Olive, Father Olive, warm, paternal, he says he's buried many of the victims. He says he's had to console the families of both the one who pulled the trigger and the one who got shot. Speaking slowly, he looks down with heavy, compassionate eyes. It hurts me a great deal, he says. The priest, the baker, the bar owner may not want to give details, but like all other Corsicans, they testify to an island steeped in problems. Every year, French mainlanders and other tourists arrive in their millions to stay in holiday homes along the coast. New houses are being built at a rate of 6,000 per year. The murders have done nothing to dampen the value of property, quite the opposite. In some cases, the killings are born out of this property boom. Criminals, it's said, have their assets tied up in the business of construction, all vying for a segment of cherished coastline, a window on the beguiling turquoise Mediterranean. At times it feels everyone is in this together. Everyone walks with the same confident swagger, blaming each other, fighting their corner, and finding a cover if they have anything to hide. Although most Corsicans are completely innocent, it is impossible to get at the truth. It's also hard to understand certain oddities. As I make my way down the Cours Napoleon, Ajacsio's main street, I pass some shops open for business, but curiously doing very little trade in the middle of winter. Pierre raises an eyebrow and turns towards me. Money laundering, he says. The people with dirty money, they buy up shops and then weeks later they let them go bankrupt. The sinister side of life, it appears, helps to explain strange events. We pass Ajacsio's railway station. It is dead. Trains sitting on rusty railway tracks haven't run for a week because of a strike, though astonishingly, no one seems to mind. Beyond it, in the distance, expensive yachts bob in the deep blue water beneath the dazzling winter sun.
Tom Esselmont in Corsica. Supporters of the plan to build a high-speed rail line between London and Birmingham are watching closely to see what happens to a huge scheme aimed at improving rail links between France and Italy. At the centre of the plan is the construction of a 35-mile tunnel through the Alps. Its supporters say the new route will enable the Atlantic to reach out to the Urals. Freight trains will zoom to and fro, boosting the shambling economies of southern Europe. Protesters noisily disagree. But the tunnelling goes on amid tight security. Christian Fraser's been to check on its progress.
He called my mobile phone sounding a little panicky shortly before our rendezvous at an anonymous motorway service station in northwest Italy. "We have to change the plan," he blurted. "They found out you're coming." This sounded interesting. My run-of-the-mill filming trip to a tunnelling project, albeit the world's most extravagant in ambition, budget and controversy, was turning into a scene from Spooks. "Who's found out what?" I asked. "The protesters," he exclaimed. "We can't meet there after all." His alarm was understandable. For 20 years, a well-marshalled army of local protesters has successfully resisted grandiose Franco-Italian plans to drill a 35-mile tunnel through the Alps. And I couldn't help feeling that perhaps their British counterparts may already be studying these tactics for any guerrilla war they launch against the London to Birmingham high-speed rail route. In Italy, they've lobbied tenaciously, and at times violently, in their fight against the rail link between Lyon and Turin. Some 400 people were injured in clashes with the police last year when the tunnel site was first fenced off. No wonder François Pelletier, the palpitating spin doctor, suspected a perfect storm was on its way. The protesters had discovered that we were coming to film the Italian bulldozers as they finally began to claw away at the soil of their beloved Susa Valley. And this in the same week that the very future of the gigantic project was called into question by European Union budget cuts. Sensibly, François directed us instead to rendezvous at a quiet local train station, and only when he was confident that we were who he thought we were did he emerge. Our clandestine journey unfolded. We had to follow François to the construction site. There are no road signs. Entering a motorway tunnel in the darkness, we suddenly dived off down an unmarked ramp past a few traffic cones and emerged into a surreal military zone. The Italian army has been deployed to keep the site secure. There's clearly embarrassment that while the French have already drilled and completed 6 miles of exploratory tunnels, on the other side of the border, Italian progress on a 5-mile tunnel amounts to a scrape in the mountainside, approximately 11 yards deep. It's a parking space for a double-decker bus. Only another 8,789 yards to go then. The military operation certainly made for great theatre. Camouflage trucks, towering fences, soldiers patrolling the woods. But the protesters were also enjoying the spectacle as they camped up in the trees, lobbing rocks at bulldozers and filming us, filming them. The EU has backed the tunnel ever since its inception in the early 1990s, but its leaders agreed last week to cut the overall budget for the Union for the next 6 years, and grand infrastructure projects could be vulnerable. Last year, the French Court of Auditors projected that the final bill for the tunnel would be double the €13 billion envisaged in the 1990s. It would end up costing more than the Channel Tunnel, nor, concluded the court, was there any certainty that it would ever return a profit. Yes, it would create 3,500 jobs, but at an average cost of a staggering €3 million per job. The naysayers insist that the tunnel will be an ugly, expensive white elephant, pointing out that the existing Transalpine road and rail routes seem to cope very nicely, thank you. They claim that projections of traffic were drawn up 20 years ago and are hopelessly out of date, and they're worried about potentially dangerous minerals buried underneath the mountains being released into the air and water. Hand on heart, even the keenest of protesters would struggle to claim the Susa Valley as an area of outstanding beauty. A narrow pass, it's already crammed with the clatter of human development. A motorway stalks across the valley floor on gigantic stilts, elevated above railway lines, quarries and factories. People have tried to cross this valley in all kinds of ways. One of the first was Hannibal, the great warrior leader of Carthage, whose own Transalpine adventure ended in Susa in 218 BC. Hannibal's journey across the mountains with 20,000 soldiers and 37 fighting elephants took him just 16 days. No one stood in his way. Now those were the days.
Christian Fraser walking in the giant footprints of Hannibal's elephants and bringing today's edition to a close. I'll be back with more from reporters far and wide in Saturday morning's programme. Do join us. Goodbye. Home from Afghanistan, and that by the end of 2014, America's war there would be over. Now, the President's made a number of key appointments as he heads into his new term. Mark Mardell's been considering just how much military experience has shaped them.
The President appears to have been to the barber's before his State of the Union speech. A severe buzz cut underlined his militant mood, but it was his hands that mesmerised me, palms wide apart, repeatedly chopping the air in tandem, as if measuring the enormous scope of his ambition. He name-checked nearly everything on his party's wish list, but one item was what they don't want. We don't need to occupy other nations or send thousands of our sons and daughters overseas, he declared. Pretty important when military action against Iran or North Korea is repeatedly said to be an option. His choice of a new Defence Secretary and new Secretary of State could be intended to lock him into that promise. John Kerry's hooked profile and shock of steely grey hair cry out to be crowned by laurels. He's been a senator for a mere 29 years, but one can easily imagine him 2,000 years ago, a patrician presence guiding imperial Rome through war and peace. But it's not appearance alone that demands that laurel wreath. Until now he's been the nearly man. He ran for president in 2004, and he seems marked by yearning to leave his stamp on history. He's smooth and nuanced, but not bloodless. It's worth remembering how he looked and sounded when he first appeared on the Washington stage. The jaw still juts out of a lean face, the abundant hair is even cut the same, but it was dark then, and he was dressed in drab military fatigues, adorned only with one colourful line of ribbons, 3 purple hearts, a silver star and a bronze star. A 27-year-old Vietnam veteran in a fury about the war that he believed had made his country lie, made his friends war criminals, and made paranoid hypocrisy a way of life. An angry young man asking senators a question which could, perhaps should, echo down the ages. How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? Then remember one of the reasons why President Obama said he chose Chuck Hagel to be America's next Secretary of State for Defense, that he'd have the respect of the troops he would lead, the first enlisted soldier to head that department. He left Southeast Asia with 2 Purple Hearts, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, the Combat Infantryman's Badge, and shrapnel lodged in his chest from a booby-trap bomb. He doesn't often wear the medals these days, but the shrapnel is still there. Hagel, a former Republican senator, is loathed by some of his former party colleagues because of his opposition to the way the Iraq War was fought. He faced an intensely hostile Senate confirmation hearing. His one-time allies pompously demanded one-word answers to complex questions, gotcha questions as they're called here, designed only to catch him out. It was one of the most dispiriting displays I've witnessed in Congress. A petty, vicious display by men entirely uninterested in attempting to divine answers about what might drive the United States foreign policy over the next 4 years. Had they not been consumed by a craving to put the boot into a turncoat, they could have discovered something about Hagel's approach to war, and so to Obama's complex, foggy foreign policy. Throughout his political career, Hagel has adopted a stance that might make him a very unusual Defence Secretary.
Hello from our own correspondent studios at Broadcasting House in London. You've downloaded the latest edition of the programme, broadcast on BBC Radio 4. It's introduced by Kate Adie.
Today, men who didn't think war was worth it rise to the top of American politics. Why people in Aleppo are turning their backs on the Free Syrian Army and looking to the Islamists for help. Murder on the streets of Corsica as the settling of old scores continues against a Mediterranean backdrop. And Hannibal conquered the mountains in just 16 days. The Italians, we learn, are taking considerably longer. So, President Obama has set out his priorities for the next 4 years in his first State of the Union address since re-election. It was a wide-ranging speech focusing partly on building a stronger America. He told Congress that 34,000 troops were coming home